Right, now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this morning. Our speaker this morning is best known as a decorative horticulturist. In fact, he is today on his way to judge at Tatton Flower Show for the RHS. His company, which he ran for 32 years, were court florists for the late Queen Mother, from whom he received a court decoration. Today's talk is one of a series of British heritage talks he normally gives to American passengers in Silver Sea cruise ships. Please welcome Howard Franklin.
Well, hello, good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Walker Theatre. It's most unusual for me to be speaking to a home crowd. In fact, I can't really quite remember the last time I actually gave a lecture in Shrewsbury. Invariably, I would be talking about flowers, obviously, and horticulture, which has been my entire life. But when I go into the Silver Sea cruise ships, we have a wonderful, wonderful audience of Americans who are desperate to learn about our British heritage. And this particular talk is one which I thought was quite suitable for us to just sit back and admire a most remarkable woman, somebody whose service to our country continues to make us really be in awe of the amount of energy and stamina that this lady has at 88 years of age. So let's look back on the life story. I can't cover, obviously, every detail of the life story, but let's look back at the life story of Her Majesty the Queen. First of all, the royal arms, which are interesting. You might just see that in the centre of the arms that they are quartered, and they represent England, Scotland, and Ireland. You can see the Irish harp to the left of the quarters. They also, very clearly at the bottom of the arms, have the Tudor rose, the shamrock, and the thistle. So you can see that our royal arms for our monarch do not include any representation for Wales, which is quite interesting, really, particularly as we live on the border of Wales. And the fact is that Wales is considered to be a principality, and that's why it's not represented in the arms of Her Majesty the Queen. Her Majesty, of course, you'll remember, ascended the throne when she was aged just 25 years of age, and she was only the second monarch in Great Britain to achieve 60 years, following in the footsteps of her great-grandmother, who, of course, was Queen Victoria. And you can see this early photograph here. She's with her mother, the other Queen Elizabeth. Incidentally, when both of these ladies were alive together, in court circles, her mother was never ever referred to as the Queen Mother, never. She was always referred to just as Queen Elizabeth, nothing other than Queen Elizabeth. And Elizabeth II, of course, in court circles, is always referred to as the Queen. She's known as the Queen. She was born on the 21st of April in 1926 at number 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, which was the London townhouse of her maternal grandparents. Her grandparents were the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. Her parents, of course, were Lord and Lady Glamis. We see here the young Princess Elizabeth, who was in her mother's arm, and her mother, of course, at this time was the Duchess of York, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. This picture was taken in 1932, and it's in the nursery at St Paul's, Waldenbury, which was the country home of the Strathmore family in Hertfordshire. Her younger sister, Princess Margaret Rose, who you can see also in the picture, was born in 1930. And this, I think, obviously indicates to us at this very early age that the young Princess Elizabeth certainly had a love for horses. This picture was taken in 1933. The miniature Welsh cottage, which is the Bwythin in the grounds of Royal Lodge, which is at Windsor. It was given to Princess Elizabeth by the people of the Principality of Wales for her 6th birthday. She and her sister, Margaret, had many hours of enjoyment in this little Welsh cottage. 1937, growing up, utterly devoted to her mother, who was the Duchess of York. There was a lifetime of closeness between these two people, and there was really a deference to her mother, who she absolutely adored, and the Queen consulted her mother on all matters. During the Second World War, Princess Elizabeth was in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She learned to drive and undertook vehicle maintenance, qualifying just before her 19th birthday. Just over a year after the outbreak of the war, Princess Elizabeth made her very first radio broadcast on what we then called the wireless to the children of Britain and to the Empire, because at that time we still had an empire. It was very sentimental in content, and right at the very end of a slightly stilted broadcast, she asked her sister, Margaret, to say good night to the children, and Margaret joined in with this broadcast in a very squeaky little voice when she said, "Good night, children." On the 10th of July in 1947, the engagement was announced between Princess Elizabeth and her third cousin, who was His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. We must always remember that the royal house that he belongs to is both Greece and Denmark. The reason for that was that Greece didn't have a monarchy, and they actually, when they decided they wanted a king, they had to go all around Europe trying to find somebody who would be willing to be the first king of Greece. And in fact, it was a Danish prince who was the brother of the King of Denmark, who became the first king of Greece. And that's why the royal household is the royal household of Greece and Denmark. And he was, of course, as we know, Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, an extremely German-sounding name. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November in 1947. His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, because following her marriage, Princess Elizabeth became the Duchess of Edinburgh, because Philip was created Duke of Edinburgh by Elizabeth's father, King George VI. So they became the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and their residence was Clarence House. Princess Elizabeth's wedding dress, incidentally, which we've just seen, was a gown that was designed by Norman Hartnell. court couturier. And the interesting thing about the dress was, you'll remember, it was very austere after at the time of the war, and they had to fly in 10,000 pearls, which were imported from America, to stitch onto Elizabeth's wedding dress. Here we can see them on their honeymoon. Not a particularly exotic honeymoon. It began here at Broadlands in Hampshire, which was the home of Philip's uncle, who was Lord Louis Mountbatten. And then 2 weeks after they had had a fortnight at Broadlands, they then went to Birkhall in Scotland with its tartan carpets and Landseer paintings, which I think you will know was for many years the home in Scotland of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The royal family have always been fond of picnics, and during the honeymoon a picnic was arranged, and here you can see members of the royal family of this period at the time of their honeymoon gathering together. There's several people in the picture that are interesting. In the Girl Guide uniform in the distance is Her Royal Highness the Princess Alexandra of Kent, and then in front of her with a cigarette in her hand is Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, although she wasn't at this time. Then the Queen, and immediately behind the Queen, can you see a lady wearing a hat? Now this is Her Royal Highness the Princess Mary, who was the Princess Royal. My very first court appointment was with this lady. Her residence was at Harwood House in Yorkshire. After I trained and qualified in London, I then was at Harwood House for a year before I started my own company. She was an extremely lovely lady. She was much happier wearing uniform than ever she was in a ball gown or fine jewels. She liked to wear uniform, which is unusual because not many members of the royal family actually that wear uniform often. I expect we can count them on one hand. Certainly Princess Margaret wore uniform often, Princess Alexandra often, and also the Princess Royal, Princess Mary, and in present times, the present Princess Royal, Princess Anne, also can often be seen in uniform. Then, just in front of the Princess Royal, that is Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, the old Duke of Gloucester, and to his left is his wife, Princess Alice of Gloucester. She was Alice Montague Douglas Scott. She was a Scottish girl, came from the Buccleuch family at Drumlanrig Castle, and it's very interesting to know that of the girls that married into the royal family at this time, we know obviously Elizabeth the Queen Mother, she lived to the age of 101, but her sister-in-law, Princess Alice, lived to nearly 103. So those Scottish girls, they really know how to live to a great age. And we can see in the foreground Gloucester and Kent cousins in the foreground of this black and white photograph. This is the accession in 1952. The Queen's father, King George VI, died from a blood clot on his heart on the 6th of February in 1952, and it's hard to think back now, but the King was only 56 years of age. He was very, very young. And Elizabeth, we will remember, was of course in Africa at Sagana Lodge in Kenya at the time. But this is the official picture, which we call the accession photograph. And here is another one of the accession photograph. The reason I think I'm really showing you this is because it very clearly illustrates the court diadem. This is the royal diadem, which we see is often on our banknotes, and it's also on our coinage. It was designed for King George IV and has been adjusted over the years. And the time that we see Her Majesty wearing the court diadem is particularly on the state opening of Parliament. It's a very treasured piece of jewellery. The Queen, of course, has magnificent jewellery. We'll see some of that as we go through the talk. But you can see it very clearly in this image. The first baby, Prince Charles, was born at Buckingham Palace on the 14th of November in 1948. And what a bonny, chubby baby he is. And I think we can see something of the young Prince George, our latest prince, in his father here. They look very similar, I think. It was to the great joy of the parents, and it was a particular joy to the King and Queen at the time, George VI and Queen Elizabeth. They were particularly overjoyed at the birth of Prince Charles, and we know throughout the whole of Charles's life, up until the Queen Mother's death, they were enormously attached to one another. So there is Charles. Now this is a very interesting photograph, because this is the birth, or not actually the birth, but the christening of the second child, who is Princess Anne, who is in the arms of her mother, Her Majesty the Queen. And we see Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, there. With his back to us, we see Prince Charles, and then to the right of the image, we see the indomitable Queen Dowager of the time, who was, of course, the Queen's grandmother, Queen Mary. She was Mary of Teck. She was, of course, from a German royal household. She was passionately proud of being British, because she married into the British royal family. There was nothing German about Queen Mary apart from her voice. Now then, of course, I never met Queen Mary, but I know several people who did meet Queen Mary, who assure me that throughout the whole of her life she had a very deep, gruff voice, rather like a man, and it was distinctly German in the way that she spoke. Now, I think the interesting thing about Queen Mary is that Her Majesty the Queen, as a young girl, spent an enormous amount of time with her grandparents, but on both sides of the family, but particularly with her grandmother, Queen Mary. Because Queen Mary, she felt her duty to educate the young Princess Elizabeth in royal etiquette and protocol. And anybody that knows anything about Her Majesty the Queen will tell you that Her Majesty the Queen is a very, very lovely, natural, normal person, but she is a stickler for correct form of etiquette and protocol, still to this day. And that was instilled in her by her grandmother, Queen Mary. And I think, as we'll see some pictures later on, if we look carefully at the Queen now, as she is, aged 88, particularly in jewels, she is the absolute image of her grandmother. She's not as tall as her grandmother, but she is the absolute image of her. Queen Mary, of course, was the great collector of objets d'art in the royal family. There is the most stunning collection of small pieces in the royal collection, which was all collected by Queen Mary and catalogued by her. She meticulously catalogued things, and she had a great habit of inviting herself to stay with people for the weekend. It must have been quite an unnerving thing for the great families of Great Britain, invariably ducal families, to know that they had Queen Mary to go to stay for the weekend. And while she was visiting, it was quite normal for Queen Mary to, to look at what possessions people had. And she had a very famous saying, which was, "I so much admire," was her favourite saying. And of course, once she had said, "I so much admire," the people she was staying with felt almost invariably obliged to say, "Well, ma'am, please, would you like to have whatever it was?" And there was one famous occasion of a ducal family where she had been invited for the weekend and they'd hidden all their best bits. And so Queen Mary arrived for the weekend and looked around the place over the weekend and couldn't actually see anything that she really could put her eye on. But I think Queen Mary must have been actually rather like the Queen, because Her Majesty the Queen has quite a wit and a dry sense of humour. And Queen Mary was being ushered out of the front door on the Monday morning with a big sigh of relief from the Duke and Duchess she'd been staying with. And the car was waiting. She got into the back of the car, and before it drove away, she wound down the window of the old Rolls-Royce car, and the Duke rushed forward, wondering what it could be. And Queen Mary leaned out of the window and she said, "Oh, by the way, I so much admire your new box hedges." So I think she did have a good sense of humour. When Princess Elizabeth was accompanying her grandmother on various outings as a young child, there are various incidents which happened. There was one occasion when they were out on a public engagement, and a very elderly gentleman said to Princess Elizabeth, "So how is the little lady today?" And Princess Elizabeth, standing alongside her grandmother, said, "I am not a little lady, I am Princess Elizabeth." Queen Mary was very quick to step in, and she said, "She may well be Princess Elizabeth, but we hope one day that she will become a little lady." And that is an interesting story. On another occasion, both Elizabeth and Margaret were accompanying Queen Mary when she was unveiling a plaque at a hospital, and the two children were standing alongside Queen Mary, and Princess Elizabeth said to her grandmother, "Granny, I hate hospitals." And Queen Mary evidently looked down to her and said, "Elizabeth, we are royal. We love hospitals." They've certainly opened plenty in their lifetimes. This is the coronation photograph of Her Majesty wearing the state robes. Here she wears St. Edward's crown. The coronation, if you remember, really pulled Britain together. It was truly a real burst of patriotism happened at the time of the coronation. I certainly remember it as a small child. We had a tiny little black and white television set, and the whole of our neighbours came in to watch because we had a television. I'm sure lots of you remember that. It really was a wonderful occasion, even though, of course, the nation was sad from the death of the Queen's father. Here we see the sacred ceremony, which dates from the coronation of William the Conqueror, which took place on Christmas Day in 1066. She was anointed with holy oil and crowned with St. Edward's crown, and they uttered the words over her, "God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness." Here is the gold state coach, And here, wearing the imperial state crown, this is the other crown, not the one she was crowned with, but the imperial state crown, which is always worn every year at the state opening of Parliament. She's returning to Buckingham Palace, and she's holding the sovereign's orb in her hand, which dates from 1661. This photograph is slightly out of order, actually. This is her actually going to Westminster Abbey at the beginning of the day. It should be 2 slides earlier, with the maids of honour, which are the daughters of dukes who accompanied her. And can you see that she's carrying the coronation bouquet, a bouquet of white orchids and lilies of the valley, and she wears the state diadem. This is a very early public engagement to the theatre. And look at the magnificent bouquet of flowers that she is given. And the tiara that she wears, one of the Queen's favourite tiaras. It's the Girls of Great Britain tiara, belonged to Queen Mary, and she always refers to it as Granny's chips. Granny's chips. It's hardly chips of diamonds. I think they're somewhat larger than chips. Her first broadcast, look what a serious looking Queen we have here. The Queen's Christmas message. At this time, of course, it was done on the wireless, the radio. But the Queen's Christmas message, ladies and gentlemen, is very, very important to her, as it is the one occasion when Her Majesty the Queen always reaffirms her religious belief. If you listen to the Christmas message every Christmas carefully, she may talk about a multitude of things that have gone on during the year, but the one message that is always in the Christmas broadcast is her own personal religious belief, as she seeks to inspire others to do good works. Much of her life since February 1952, the Queen has dealt with her red boxes. Leather covered, they contain state documents which require her signature of assent. And here she sits at Queen Mary's writing desk. This is the desk that Queen Mary used, and it passed to the Queen, and she still uses this desk. Now we come to her Prime Ministers, Winston Churchill, Eden, Macmillan and Hume. Harold Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Brown, and now David Cameron. She's had 12 Prime Ministers in all. She's seen them come and she's seen them go. We all know they have an audience with her every week at Buckingham Palace in the audience chamber. It's a private conversation that they have with the monarch. There are some interesting facts about Prime Ministers. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, look at the Prime Ministers that we have on the screen at the moment. John Major, bad press, got a lot of bad press. I think quite highly regarded by Her Majesty the Queen. How do we know that? We know it because he has the highest order of chivalry in Great Britain. He is a Knight of the Garter. The Queen doesn't hand those out lightly. And so John Major is a Knight of the Garter. Tony Blair has nothing. Brown has nothing. Cameron is still in office. I think that says quite a lot in very quiet, subtle ways and tones, that the Queen admires certain of her prime ministers and perhaps not the others. A lot has been said and has been written about Margaret Thatcher. She and the Queen, same age. Again, a lot of speculation in the press, which we can't know what the relationship between Her Majesty and Margaret Thatcher was. I would like to express a personal point of view that I think that the Queen saw a very strong woman who was very suitable for a particular time in British history, particularly with regard to the Falklands War. Certainly, Her Majesty regarded Margaret Thatcher so highly that she awarded her the highest honour that she possibly could, that she was created as a Lady of the Garter. And again, that quietly says an awful lot about what the Queen thought about Margaret Thatcher. This is looking down from the dome of St. Paul's at Margaret Thatcher's funeral. Her Majesty the Queen does not attend her Prime Minister's funerals. There have only been 2 funerals of Prime Ministers that Her Majesty has attended. One was Winston Churchill, who was given the highest possible state funeral, and the other one was Margaret Thatcher. And that tells us everything. We don't actually need to speculate too much about what the Queen thought of Margaret Thatcher, because she showed it to the nation. She showed it to the world what she thought of Margaret Thatcher. And here she is, standing with the government. You can see that she's not isolated. She's got His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, with her, her husband, but she is surrounded by the government of the time. And here she is, paying her respects to, I think, a woman that she regarded very highly. And this is a very interesting photograph, because this is a look that we very rarely see on the Queen's face. We don't see this look on the Queen's face. This is where the hearse is being driven away from St. Paul's Cathedral. And don't you think that's a very wistful expression on the Queen's face? Bearing in mind that they're the same age, that they were the same age. To the left of the Queen is the Bishop of London, Bishop Chartres, and of course the Archbishop of Canterbury on the right-hand side, and the Dean of St. Paul's and Prince Philip. I think it's a rather spectacular photograph, that, of Margaret Thatcher's funeral. Overseas tours included 3 months at the beginning of her reign in the African continent, where it was in Africa, you'll remember, that Her Majesty pledged her devotion to service, whether her life be long or short. To Canada, it was here that she made her first live television broadcast, and she spoke in a live broadcast alternately in French and then into English, and then French and into English, because she is very much a linguist with regard to the French language. It was there in Canada. This is an interesting picture, because I'm sure you'll all remember a very similar picture to this of the late Diana and Charles. Do you remember there was one taken of Diana and Charles where they said that they'd just had a blazing row? It probably was totally untrue. This is a similar picture of the Queen and Prince Philip, and I'm sure they haven't had a blazing row. It just happens to be how they've been captured. And this is on the tour to Australasia Here she is, again wearing Granny's tiara. It was a 7-month-long tour. Can you imagine going away for 7 months, leaving your small children behind in the loving care of their nannies, and of course of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and the rest of the royal family? They boarded the ship the Gothic on the Australasian tour, and it was on that tour that she even took her coronation dress with her, so the people of her Commonwealth could see her wearing the coronation dress. This is not the coronation dress here, but she did wear it for all the various state openings of Parliament in New Zealand, in Australia, in Fiji, in the other Australasian countries. Here she's wearing a dress which you can just see is sprigged with little bunches of wattle, and she's got a spray of wattle on her shoulder. That is the national flower of Australia, and that is a compliment. And this photograph was taken prior to her going to Australia. It was the sort of advertising photograph for the Australian tour. Here she is, a lovely casual photograph on board the ship Britannia. Britannia was used for 2 major tours of the Commonwealth in 1977, which was, of course, a Jubilee year. The Queen sailed 56,000 miles in Britannia. It was decommissioned on the 11th of December 1997 at Portsmouth, and it is one of the few public occasions when the Queen shed a tear. A solitary tear trickled down her cheek as she said goodbye to a very, very much loved floating home, Britannia. Any of you that go to Leith in Scotland will be able to go over the Britannia. You'll see that it's a magnificent ship, very primitive in some respects. The state visit to the USA in 1983. President Reagan, it was at Hurst Court where she was being entertained. I think personally a slightly over-ruffled dress, a new hairdresser, didn't quite work. She's wearing another of her grandmother's tiaras. It was a tour that was a big success, but had 1 or 2 glitches in it. A private visit by President Reagan. It's always said that her favorite American president was President Reagan, and his wife Nancy. She's still alive, of course, she's very elderly. This was a private visit to Windsor in 1982, riding here. The Queen here is age 56, and riding President Reagan was 71. I think that the Queen and Prince Philip had a very genuine friendship with the Reagans. It's well known, the Queen's love of horses. Like her mother before her, the Queen is a very keen horsewoman, particularly in her interest in racing and bloodstock. Here we can see the traditional carriage drive at the royal meeting at Windsor, which is a week-long occasion when the Queen has house guests, and there's the traditional carriage drive every lunchtime. The royal stud, of course, this is the Queen last year at the royal meeting at Windsor. The royal stud is at Sandringham, of course, and Ascot is really one of her most favourite weeks because it's fun, and the Queen actually does do fun. You can see the racing. And here she looks slightly glum, actually, but she's with John Warren here. This is John Warren, who is her racing manager, and he is her advisor on bloodstock. She evidently, I'm told by people who know, that her knowledge of horses is extreme. They should have her on mastermind with it. She's so knowledgeable on bloodstock. An early photograph of the Queen with another love, dogs. The Queen has both corgis and she has dorgies. That was a mistake. A dorgie was a mistake between one of Princess Margaret's dachshunds and one of the Queen Mother's corgis. And so there was this breed that was produced called dorgies. So as well as there being corgis, there are also dorgies. The number of corgis is greatly reduced in recent times. I expect you could say the interesting thing about this photograph is the 2-bar electric fire in the grate for heating a very large room at Buckingham Palace. I would imagine it's for extra heat. And there's another one in the grounds of Buckingham Palace with dogs. And here with one of the private secretaries. This is Lord Fellows. He's long retired, out in the garden having a chat, but you can see again, we can see a dorgie with its back to us. That's a dorgie, with the one nearest the Queen. Devoted to her mother, they spoke every morning at 11 o'clock every morning on the telephone. So after the Queen Mother's death, it must have been a great blank in the Queen's life not to have her mother there to have the daily chat. An early picture of a picnic. Royal family very fond of picnics. There's always a lot of stuff written in magazines and newspapers about them not being a close family. Here we see a very close family. I think they actually are all devoted to each other. There used to be great speculation about the Queen and Prince Philip not being close, but my gosh, it's been an enduring marriage, and I'm sure he is the most devoted of consorts and husbands. Her eldest son, Prince Charles, was created Prince of Wales in 1958, July 58, but his investiture didn't take place until July 1969 at Carnarvon Castle. It was a rather staged event which was organised by Lord Snowdon. Here we can see the Queen rather got up in a medieval outfit. Then we come on to investitures. This is one of the really special investitures, and to receive this order and decoration, which was founded in 1896, is so special because it's at the personal gift of the monarch. It's the Royal Victorian Order. You can see the decoration there, the Royal Victorian Order, and it is given for personal service to the monarch. So there's no political intervention whatsoever with this decoration. And this is the decoration which was very recently given to our Lord Lieutenant, who has become Sir Algernon Heber Percy, and he is a Knight of the Royal Victorian Order. This is the Order of the Bath, and this takes place at Westminster Abbey in Henry VII's chapel. It's awarded to officers of the armed services and to a very small number of civil servants. The earliest record is from 1128. The first person to be awarded the Order of the Bath was Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou. There are two divisions of the Order of the Bath, military and civil, and it was founded properly in 1725 by King George I. And you can see Her Majesty here with one page going into Westminster Abbey. That is the Dean of Westminster who is accompanying her to the service of the Order of the Bath. Then we have the Order of the Thistle. This is the highest honour in Scotland. This was founded by King James III in about 1500. The Thistle Chapel is in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. The order's cloak is green and it's lined with white taffeta with green and gold tassels. The hat is black with white osprey feathers on the hat, and a single page carries the cloak behind the Queen for the Order of the Thistle. She attended this very, very recently. You know how she has a week at Holyrood to do Scottish engagements. Nothing to do with Balmoral. Balmoral is strictly holidays. Holyrood is the court moving to Scotland, and she was there for a week recently. That particular page that's carrying is the page that fainted at the state opening of Parliament. He's doing better at the Thistle. This is Garter Day, and it's on the following Monday after the Queen's birthday parade. I'm very lucky that I get invited to Garter Day every year. I have a seat in St George's Chapel, and it's a great privilege for me to be able to attend this event. It's very, very splendid. Anybody that has ever been lucky enough to know about St George's Chapel and that this particular service and ceremony is that the music and the choral pieces are absolutely breathtaking. Here you can see the Prince of Wales, Her Majesty the Queen, and His Royal Highness the Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, here in this photograph in their garter robes. Now, we couldn't do a talk about the Queen without mentioning Lady Diana Spencer, Princess Diana, as she became on her marriage to the Prince of Wales on the 29th of July 1981 at St Paul's Cathedral. I think that, again, much has been written about the late Princess of Wales, Diana, Princess of Wales. I think, looking back on the whole story, what history will tell us more than anything is that she was the mother of two remarkable young men. And the young men are growing up now, and one of them, Prince William, has his own son, Prince George. Prince Harry, very much the adventure man, but I do see in those children very much of their mother's nature. And I think we have to thank God for the fact that Diana was their mother. Their first child, of course, was Prince William, and he was baptized in the music room at Buckingham Palace. And here we can see the official photograph after the baptism. It's a curious thing that the head of the Church of England, Her Majesty the Queen, prefers to have her babies baptized in a secular building. Most of the royal babies have been baptized at Buckingham Palace in the music room. And here we can see Prince William on Diana's lap with Prince Charles, Her Majesty the Queen, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. This is a rare photograph with Diana and the Queen together, both happily smiling, and I think that, in fact, there probably was a very good relationship between these two human beings. The state jewels, which very seldom seen only at coronations, and some of them, including the sword and, of course, the state crown, are used at the state opening of Parliament. This is the state opening of Parliament in Scotland. Now, I don't know whether you can tell why it's Scotland as opposed to England, and the clue is in the top of the coach. Can you see the decoration on the top of the coach, that in between the urns of flowers there are Scottish thistles? Can you see the Scottish thistles? And this is the Scottish state coach, which is used in Scotland mainly. She wears the Russian fringe tiara, which is the tiara that she wore on her wedding day, and Princess Anne wore it on her wedding day also. I was privileged to make the wedding bouquet for Princess Anne on her wedding at Westminster Abbey. Here is Her Majesty wearing George IV's state diadem on the way to Westminster for the state opening of Parliament. And here is one in the new coach. That's this year's state opening of Parliament. The state opening, of course, draws on centuries of tradition, and the setting, of course, is the House of Lords. This is the Diamond Jubilee State Coach, drawn by 6 horses, built in Australia by W.J. Frecklington, and it was used for the first time this year in 2014. Here we see the chamber of the House of Lords. The state crown, of course, comes in beforehand. It weighs 3 pounds, and the state sword. And here we can see the people who attend on the Queen, and they are the people who really are her security, because they are what the yeomen of the guard, commonly called beefeaters, and then also the mental blockage, the gentlemen with the plumed hats, or an even older order of guards that guard the Queen. I don't know, can anybody tell me?
Gentlemen at arms.
The what?
Gentlemen at arms.
Gentlemen at arms, thank you very much. They're the gentlemen at arms that wear the plumed hats. They are essentially the private guards to the Queen. Here we can see the Queen seated in the House of Lords on her throne with Prince Philip alongside her. Now we have the Prince of Wales and his wife, the Duchess of Cornwall. She's wearing one of the Queen Mother's tiaras. That's the Boucheron tiara, sometimes known as the Cartier tiara, but it in fact was designed by Boucheron. And can you see to the left of the picture the cap of maintenance? That's rather important, the cap of maintenance. It's the symbol of monarchy. It's used at coronations. If it's a king that is being crowned, he wears it, the cap of maintenance, to go to Westminster Abbey, and the crown is put over the cap of maintenance. And you can see in the centre of the Queen's crown there is red velvet, which is the same as the cap of maintenance, which is the symbol of. A lot of things to do with royalty are symbolic. She always wears, of course, full court dress with regard to a long white dress and white gloves, and the train, of course, which is, I think, 20 feet long, and just off the picture would be 2 ladies in waiting who also are in attendance at this occasion. Reading the speech, the gentleman to the left at the top is the Marquis of Cholmondeley from Cholmondeley Castle, quite nearby in Cheshire, who is the Lord Chamberlain, who is in charge of proceedings in the Palace of Westminster. Prince Philip. I don't expect the Queen could possibly have got through her life without Prince Philip. Born on the 10th of June 1921, he is aged 93 and is still accompanying the Queen on most of her public engagements. He was born in Corfu, the Isle of Corfu, the son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Princess Alice of Battenberg. Princess Alice of Battenberg was a sister of Lord Mountbatten, and he is the longest lived male member of the British royal family ever in history. There has been no male member of the British royal family has lived to the age of 93. And this is a lovely photograph of him. This is a favourite portrait of him, painted by Brian Organ, and it is reputed to be the Queen's favourite portrait of Prince Philip. It's reputed to be. Here we have Her Majesty the Queen wearing some of the jewels which are so important to her. The tiaras that she wears are most impressive. This is the Grand Duchess Vladimir's tiara, and it was purchased by Queen Mary in 1921. The Grand Duchess Vladimir was an aunt of Tsar Nicholas II. There are 15 intertwined diamond ovals, and Her Majesty can wear either pearls hanging in it, or she can have the Cambridge emeralds hanging in it. There you can see the Grand Duchess Vladimir on the left with it wearing the tiara. You can see Queen Mary wearing it with the emeralds hanging in it, and she wears around her neck and on her bodice all the Cambridge emeralds, which are very famous. The Queen also wears this tiara very often. This is the Russian fringe tiara, worn on her wedding day, as I told you, worn by Princess Anne, and worn by the Queen very often. This is the aquamarine suite of jewels, more modern in design. These jewels were given to the Queen as a gift from an Eastern potentate. Granny's tiara here, the Girls of Great Britain tiara, and the amethyst suite of jewels. Now, the tragic death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in August 1997 led to a national outpouring of grief. On the day before her funeral, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh viewed the thousands of floral tributes outside Buckingham Palace. Following Diana's death, of course, we'll remember that the film The Queen was produced with Helen Mirren starring as the Queen. And an interesting thing was recorded, that Helen Mirren began that film playing the part of the Queen, very much a Republican, and she ended the film very much converted to being a fervent monarchist. This is Princess Margaret, who died on February, died in February 2002. She was only 71 years of age, and I've got a rare photograph here. This is an extremely rare photograph. Her coffin rested in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The funeral was on Friday the 15th of February at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the reason why I have this photograph is that I was actually involved with doing flowers for this funeral. Unusually, for a member of the royal family, Princess Margaret, I think I'm right in saying, is the only member of the royal family who has ever been cremated. And after the service here at St. George's in Windsor, the coffin went to Slough Crematorium, and her ashes are buried alongside her parents in St. George's Chapel. And here are some of the royal family attending Princess Margaret's funeral that day. 3 days later, after Princess Margaret's funeral, the Queen was in Jamaica on a Commonwealth visit to on her Jubilee tour. You'll remember 2002. The Queen was there 3 days later in Jamaica, cracking on with business. Now then, here we have somebody who I never lay claim to knowing members of the royal family personally, but I did have the great honour of serving Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth on numerous occasions, and I did the birthday flowers at Karen's house for 15 birthdays in succession at Karen's house. And this is a wonderful photograph of the Queen Mother on her 100th birthday. She was 100 on this particular day, and it's a really special photograph of her. She died aged 101 at Royal Lodge, and her funeral was on Tuesday the 9th of April 2002. I was actually invited to the funeral. I did go to the funeral. It was at Westminster Abbey, and 1 million people lined the route of the Queen Mother's for the Queen Mother's procession. There's something interesting about this photograph. You can see the flowers. The flowers are always obviously interesting at royal events, and these flowers, it's a wreath. Her Majesty the Queen, whenever she sends flowers to a funeral, she always sends a wreath. She doesn't send a spray. Now, if you think back to Princess Diana's funeral, there was a long spray of lilies. Do you remember that on the coffin? That was not a royal tribute. That tribute was from the Spencer family. Those lilies were from the Spencers. Royal tributes are always wreaths. They're always old-fashioned circles. The reason for that is Her Majesty the Queen firmly believes that the wreath is the symbol of eternity. It has no beginning and it has no end. It is a circular form, and that's why it's always used for royal funeral tributes. And this funeral tribute was white roses, which was the Queen Mother's favourite flower. Remember, she had been the Duchess of York, and the white rose is the symbol of York. And so white roses of York, and it was infilled with heather from Caithness, which is where her residence was at the Castle of May. That was the infilling in between the roses. Now then, who has replaced the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret in the Queen's life? Who is the most closely treasured member of the royal family to the Queen, apart from her children, of course, obviously? And it's this lovely lady. This is Her Royal Highness the Princess Alexandra, the Honourable Lady Ogilvy. She was originally Princess Alexandra of Kent. She married Sir Angus Ogilvy, and she is the first cousin of Her Majesty the Queen. Here's a fabulous early photograph of the Queen and Princess Alexandra together. They are great friends. They're first cousins, of course. Princess Alexandra was a granddaughter of George V and Queen Mary. She was a granddaughter, and so is the Queen, a granddaughter. She is now 77 years of age. There she is with the Queen. The Queen is, of course, older, as we know, 88. Princess Alexandra, 77. First cousins. Daughter of Prince George of Kent, who was one of the King's brothers, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. Her mother was Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, who was a cousin of Prince Philip. So you can see it's all very interrelated. And I'm told that it is now to Princess Alexandra that the Queen is likely to make the telephone call. So I find that in my heart of hearts very reassuring that there is somebody there who the Queen could have as her confidant, who is a member of her family, other than her husband and her children, of course. The Queen is not always dressed up, often seen in a headscarf, often seen in other garb. She's a sensible woman. She here is at the Windsor Horse Show, I think, in clement weather. Then we have somebody else coming into the picture, Camilla Parker Bowles. She is now aged 67, and her husband, Prince Charles, is 66. Their wedding, of course, took place on April the 9th in 2005. You'll remember there was a civil ceremony and then a service of prayer and dedication in St. George's Chapel with 720 guests. And she now seems to have settled into the royal family. This is a picture that I really love, this picture. It shows 3 generations. Her Majesty the Queen, our present monarch, Prince Charles, who will become the next monarch, Prince William, who will become the following monarch, and of course we now have the little Prince George. So again, we're back to, like that original photograph with Queen Mary, we're back to 4 generations. The Silver Jubilee, lots of walkabouts for the Queen when she celebrated 25 years on the throne. All these various public occasions, smiling, never looks bored, always interested in what's going on. More recent Jubilee photograph. Here's the Silver Jubilee. You'll remember this. The Gold State coach was out for the Silver Jubilee. It wasn't out for the Diamond Jubilee, but it was for the Silver Jubilee. Do you remember the hat with 25 bells that hung down the back of the hat? She wore pink. The balcony appearance for the Silver Jubilee. In the background, Lord Mountbatten of Burma is there. Princess Margaret in pink is there. The Golden Jubilee. Again, the state coach was used for the Golden Jubilee. 50 years our monarch. Crowds. And now the more recent Diamond Jubilee and the Olympic Games. I really don't know how Her Majesty fits it all in, because the Olympic Games was in the same year, if you remember, as the Diamond Jubilee. Here she is opening the Olympic Games, here with Lord Coe, looking a little bit serious as to whatever he's describing. The Jubilee torch arriving at Windsor Castle on a rather wet and showery day. And who would have ever thought that she could have been talked into this? And it just shows that what we perceive of Her Majesty the Queen is not everything. There is always something other to the Queen that we know nothing at all about. What we do know about the Queen is that she's accompanied by her dogs wherever she goes. And here we have Daniel Craig, James Bond, on a visit to Buckingham Palace at the time of the Olympic Games. And of course, the famous parachute jump. Of course, not Her Majesty the Queen, but a very good little twist. And I think she entered, obviously, into the spirit of the wonderful Olympic Games. I'm sure we all recall this. There Her Majesty is enjoying the Games. And this, I think this was more than special, because this was the state visit to the Republic of Ireland. And this is the banquet at Dublin Castle. And the lady in blue is Mary McAleese, who was the President of Ireland. And can you see, interestingly, on the Queen's shoulder a brooch that we hardly, I don't think I've ever seen her wear this brooch because it's so historic. It is the Irish harp, which we see in the royal arms. That is the exact shape that appears on the royal arms. And of course it dates back, that piece of jewellery, to when Ireland was under British rule. And you might have said, how dare she wear it on her shoulder? But it was a compliment to the country of Ireland and to the warm affection that the Queen feels towards the people of Ireland. And I think she was hugely brave to go on her state visit to Ireland. It could have been so easy when we read about the awful things that happen in the world on a daily basis. It could have been so easy for something to have happened to Her Majesty the Queen. Here she is with the Taoiseach, in other words, the Prime Minister. The Irish people enveloped her with warmth and enthusiasm. This was the Westminster Hall. This is where all great addresses are always given to royalty in Westminster Hall. And this is the great public address of loyalty from the Parliaments, which was given in Westminster Hall at the time of the Jubilee. We remember this vividly because it's quite recent, it's in our mind. Her Majesty arriving at Windsor for the pageant of the horse. 500 horses took part in this wonderful show. Windsor Castle in the background. There were 800 performers that performed. And I was looking at the programme earlier this morning, actually, and interestingly, because the performers came from all over the Commonwealth, interestingly, one of the performers at the pageant of the horse was Rolf Harris, was one of the performers. And this is Her Majesty here again at Windsor. You can tell it's Windsor by the great tapestries. Windsor's famous for its tapestries. She hosts a luncheon for the world's monarchs. And look, they all pitched up for it. All the monarchs of the world pitched up. You can see some of them that you will recognise. Her Majesty Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, you will see on the front row. I was intrigued, for example, by the Emperor of Japan on the left, and when the Emperor of Japan was greeted by the Queen and Prince Philip, when the Emperor and the Empress arrived, Prince Philip gave the lowest of bows to the Emperor of Japan. And that's royal protocol again, because an emperor is of a higher rank than a prince. And so Prince Philip was showing due respect to an emperor when he greeted him at the entrance to Windsor Castle. You can see the Queen of Denmark, Queen Marguerite of Denmark, the very tall lady in the grey suit. But the ones that are interesting, the really interesting ones, are the people who the Queen had seated either side of her at lunch. And they're the people that are seated either side of her in the picture. Because as we look at this picture, to the left of the Queen looking at the picture is the King of Romania. And to the right is the King of Bulgaria. Now you might say, why would Her Majesty give precedence to the King of Romania and the King of Bulgaria? And the reason is that Her Majesty does never ever look upon people from royal houses as if they were deposed or not reigning. She looks at them in the same way as when she was made monarch, she looks at the year that they became monarchs of their countries. In fact, they are the senior ones. Am I running over time? We're nearly at the end. I'm sorry. I could go on talking all day. This is the pageant. We'll just look at these last photographs. the pageant. I wanted you particularly to see that's Shropshire. That is the copy of the coronation bouquet that I made for the Queen when she came to Shropshire. Westminster Abbey. Gosh, I have got a lot of pictures on, but these are the last ones. State photographs. And the last picture, I just want you, this one's an interesting one. This is the end of a hard day's work. The Queen back at Buckingham Palace, watching the news on the television, cast asunder her hat, squashed hair. But the last picture, I wanted you to hear a rendition of our national anthem, if you would indulge me, by the choristers of all the chapels royal and the gentlemen of the chapels royal. But do you want to just say something before? No? This is the state photograph. But it is a most wonderful rendition of the national anthem. It's all three verses. The second verse is very politically incorrect. But you will hear, it's a most wonderful rendition. Queen's presence at Buckingham Palace is a constant reassurance to us, the people of Great Britain. She is a symbol of continuing stability. Long may she reign. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.